Joanna Gaines hospitalized before the holidays. On Wednesday, the Magnolia Network star shared this pic of herself lying in a hospital bed. In good spirits, holding up a peace sign as she wears shades and a hospital gown.
The image of Joanna Gaines in a hospital bed felt like a glitch in the universe. We're so used to seeing her as this unstoppable force of nature, gracefully balancing power tools and family life without breaking a sweat. But when Chip posted that photo, the silence was deafening. It wasn't just about a surgery, but the vulnerability of a family we've grown up with, leaving everyone wondering if the Magnolia empire was finally facing a breaking point. The utterly unmanageable pain. It is easy to forget that before she was the queen of farmhouse chic, Joanna Gaines was a competitive cheerleader. We see the polished version of her now, but that athletic background came with a hidden, heavy price tag. Back in 1990, during her high school years, Joanna suffered a significant back injury while cheering.
The specific cheerleading stunt that caused Joanna's chronic pain was the basket toss. It's an iconic stunt, but it comes with some significant risks. Joanna did one that went wrong during her high school days, and it led to herniated discs in her back.
At the time, you just brush those things off, right? You're young, you feel invincible, and you assume a little rest will fix everything. But for Joanna, that moment was the beginning of a 2-decade-long battle with her own body. It wasn't just a bad back, it was a ticking time bomb of structural damage that stayed quiet while she was busy building an empire, raising 5 kids, and flipping countless houses alongside Chip. The reality finally caught up with her in a major way back in 2022. While the rest of the world was watching her latest design projects, Joanna was privately dealing with pain that had become utterly unmanageable. She was diagnosed with a herniated disc that was severely compressing her nerves, a condition that makes even standing up feel like an agonizing feat of strength. This wasn't something a heating pad or a massage could fix anymore. She needed a microdiscectomy, a serious surgical procedure to remove the portion of the disc that was putting pressure on her spinal nerve. For someone who is constantly on the move, someone whose entire brand is built on the idea of doing and creating, being forced into a hospital bed is a psychological blow just as much as a physical one. When the news broke, it felt like a collective gasp went up from the fans. Chip, ever the supportive partner, was right there, but his posts during that time carried a weight that people weren't used to seeing. This wasn't the goofy, joking Chip we see on Fixer Upper. This was a man watching his partner face the reality of her own fragility. The surgery itself is a delicate process, and the recovery is even more grueling because it requires something Joanna isn't naturally good at: stillness. She had to spend weeks in forced rest, unable to lift her children or even walk through the silos. It was a period of intense vulnerability that stripped away the superwoman narrative. The physical toll of that surgery served as a massive wake-up call for the entire Gaines family. It forced them to confront the fact that they aren't made of steel. Seeing Joanna in that hospital gown, tethered to monitors, was a stark reminder that even the most successful lives can be derailed by a single physical failure. It wasn't just about the back, it was about the years of pushing through that had finally reached a dead end. For the fans, seeing her in that state brought a sense of shared humanity. We all have those moments where our bodies finally say, "No more," and watching Joanna navigate that with her trademark grace, even while clearly in pain, made the bond between her and her audience even tighter. It was the moment the Magnolia dream met the hard reality of human health. But as the physical wounds began to heal, a much deeper, more invisible exhaustion was starting to bubble to the surface. The silent struggle of the soul. If the back surgery was a sudden, jarring physical crash, the mental and emotional burnout Joanna faced was more like a slow-burning fire that eventually consumed the air in the room. We often look at the Gaines' life and see a highlight reel of perfectly staged living rooms and heartwarming family dinners, but the sheer velocity of their rise to fame created a pressure cooker that nobody, no matter how grounded, is truly prepared for. For years, Joanna operated on a level of high-functioning stress that became her baseline. She wasn't just a mom or a designer anymore, she was a global brand, a network executive, and a public figure whose every move was scrutinized by millions. Eventually, the weight of being on all the time started to fracture the very foundation she had worked so hard to build. She eventually opened up about a period where she felt like she was running on an empty tank, describing a sense of chronic fatigue that went far beyond just needing a good night's sleep. It was a soul-deep exhaustion. This wasn't just about being busy. It was about the loss of her internal why. When your passion becomes a massive corporate machine, the joy of the craft can easily get smothered by the demands of the business. Joanna confessed that she had reached a point where the chaos of their success was starting to drown out her peace. She was facing the classic symptoms of burnout, a sense of detachment, a lack of inspiration, and the feeling that she was just performing a role rather than living her life. This internal crisis led to some of the most difficult conversations she and Chip ever had. It's one thing to navigate a physical injury where the treatment is clear, but how do you fix a spirit that's just tired of the noise? Chip had to step into a different kind of role here, not just the protector or the laborer, but the emotional anchor who was willing to let the empire slow down if it meant saving Joanna. They started talking about the Magnolia dream in a way they never had before, questioning if the growth was worth the cost of their mental well-being. This was the era where they began to pull back, famously deciding to end their original show at the height of its popularity, a move that baffled the industry but was entirely necessary for their survival as a couple and as individuals. The fans felt this shift. There was a period where Joanna's presence felt different, more reflective, perhaps a bit more guarded, but also more honest. She began writing about the importance of silence and stillness in her books and essays, effectively giving her audience permission to also admit when they were overwhelmed. By being transparent about her struggle with burnout and the mental toll of the hustle, she humanized the brand in a way that marketing experts couldn't have planned. It transformed the story from one of perfect success to one of human resilience. They weren't just building houses anymore. They were trying to figure out how to build a life that didn't require them to sacrifice their mental health at the altar of more. It was a brave, quiet revolution in a world that always demands more. To grasp how they reached this breaking point, we have to go back to the very beginning, long before the cameras and the crowds arrived in Waco. The roots of two very different worlds. Before their names were joined by an ampersand, Chip and Joanna were two kids growing up in Texas with completely different blueprints for life. If you looked at their childhoods, you wouldn't necessarily peg them as a future power couple. Chip was the quintessential wild child of Albuquerque, New Mexico, before his family eventually moved to Texas. From day one, he was a disruptor. He wasn't the kid sitting quietly in the back of the class. He was the one outside trying to figure out how to turn a pile of scrap wood into a business. He had this restless, entrepreneurial spirit that didn't just want to follow the rules, it wanted to rewrite them. He was always looking for the in, the deal, or the next big adventure, driven by a father who taught him the value of a hard day's work and a mother who gave him the confidence to fail. On the flip side, Joanna's early years were defined by a much quieter, more internalized kind of strength. Growing up in Rose Hill, Kansas, and later moving to Texas, she was the daughter of a Korean mother and a father of German and Lebanese descent. This cultural blend gave her a unique perspective, but it also made her feel like an outsider during her formative years. She was painfully shy, the kind of kid who would rather blend into the wallpaper than take center stage. Her father owned a Firestone tire shop, and that shop became her sanctuary. She spent her afternoons there, watching her dad handle customers and keep the books. It was in that grease-scented environment that she first learned the mechanics of a small business, but more importantly, she learned the value of a solid reputation and a steady hand. While Chip was out making a name for himself as a serial entrepreneur at Baylor University, doing everything from washing cars to running a laundry service for students, Joanna was finding her footing in a completely different way. She moved to New York City for an internship at 48 Hours with Dan Rather, thinking her future was in broadcast journalism. New York was a long way from the quiet tire shop in Waco. It was in the chaos of the city that her aesthetic sensibilities began to wake up. She wasn't just looking at the news. She was looking at the boutiques, the window displays, and the way a simple space could make a person feel something. She was a girl from Kansas with a hidden eye for design, trapped in a career path that was all about facts and deadlines. When she finally returned to Texas, she was a different person, but she was still looking for her thing. She started working at her father's tire shop again, but this time, she was the one behind the counter. She was the girl in the tire shop that everyone in town started talking about. Meanwhile, Chip was already deep into the world of house flipping, living on the edge of financial ruin most of the time because he would rather buy a broken-down shack than a safe investment. He was a man with a vision, but no anchor. They were two people moving in parallel lines through the same small town, one fueled by a chaotic drive to build, and the other by a quiet need to create beauty out of the mundane. They were the perfect puzzle pieces, but they hadn't even met yet, and neither had any idea that their separate lives were about to collide in a way that would change the landscape of American television and the city of Waco forever. But all those separate experiences were just a dress rehearsal for the day Chip walked into that Firestone shop and saw a photo of Joanna on the wall. The collision of two worlds. The story of how Chip and Joanna actually met feels less like a corporate origin story and more like a scene from a movie where destiny is working overtime. Chip, true to his impulsive nature, didn't meet Joanna in person at first. He fell in love with her through a photograph. He was at her father's Firestone shop, getting his brakes done, when he saw a picture of Joanna on the wall behind the counter. Right then and there, he told himself he was going to marry that girl. Most people would call that a delusional overstatement, but for Chip, it was just a Tuesday. He started frequenting the shop more than any human being actually needs to for vehicle maintenance, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman from the photo. When he finally did, he didn't exactly sweep her off her feet with a smooth pickup line. In fact, he was an hour and a half late for their first date. Joanna, who was naturally punctual and a bit more reserved, was ready to write him off before the night even started. She was sitting on her parents' porch, probably wondering why she had agreed to go out with this loud, frantic guy who couldn't even keep a schedule. But when Chip finally rolled up in his beat-up truck, he had a way of filling the space with so much energy that it was impossible to stay mad. They went to a local restaurant, but instead of the usual small talk, Chip talked about his big dreams, his business ideas, and his house-flipping adventures. Joanna, the girl who had always been a bit more cautious, found herself drawn to his reckless optimism. He saw potential where others saw trash, and for some reason, she saw potential in him. It was a classic case of opposites attracting, the anchor meeting the sail. Their early marriage was anything but glamorous. If you think the fixer-upper lifestyle started with a big budget and a crew, you haven't seen the crap shacks they lived in during those first few years. They were essentially living in a state of perpetual renovation. They would buy a house that most people wouldn't even walk into, fix it up while living in the middle of the dust and the debris, and then sell it to move on to the next one. There were times when they had no hot water, times when the wind blew straight through the walls, and times when they weren't sure how they were going to pay the bills. Chip was always pushing for the next big deal, while Joanna was trying to figure out how to make these dilapidated spaces feel like a home. It was during these lean years that they developed their rhythm. Chip would break things down, and Joanna would build them back up with a sense of style that was starting to become her signature. They were a two-person team against the world, and the world wasn't always kind. They faced financial scares that would have broken most couples, including a moment where they were nearly arrested because of a misunderstanding regarding unpaid tickets and a lack of funds. But every time they hit a wall, they leaned into each other instead of pulling apart. Joanna began to realize that Chip's chaotic energy was exactly what she needed to push her out of her comfort zone. And Chip realized that Joanna's eye for detail and her grounding presence were the only things keeping him from flying off the rails. They were learning the hard way that a marriage isn't just about love. It's about surviving the mess you make together. By the time they decided to open a small shop on Bosque Boulevard, they had already survived enough fixer-uppers to know that as long as they had each other, the house didn't actually have to be standing to feel like home. These were the years that forged the Magnolia brand in the fire of real-world struggle, long before the cameras ever showed up to document it. But those grueling years of flipping houses were just the groundwork for a risky gamble that would finally give their shared vision a physical home and a name. The Magnolia Seed. In 2003, with a tiny bit of savings and a massive amount of "let's see what happens" energy, Chip and Joanna opened the doors to the original Magnolia Market on Bosque Boulevard. This wasn't the sprawling destination with the silos and the gardens that we know today. It was a modest, slightly cramped little shop that smelled intensely of cedar, fresh paint, and ambition. It was filled with vintage treasures, refurbished furniture, and architectural salvage that Joanna had spent months hunting down at flea markets and garage sales. This was her laboratory.
And weave that story throughout everything we do at Magnolia. It's through the visual displays at the market that we get to show our guests visually who we are and what we value.
For the first time, she wasn't just decorating a house for a client or living in a construction zone. She was testing her farmhouse aesthetic on the public. She did it all while balancing a toddler on her hip and managing the books in the back room. The name Magnolia itself was a callback to their early dating days, a romantic gesture from Chip, who used to climb up into magnolia trees to pluck flowers for her. It was a beautiful small-town success story, but the reality of the daily grind was starting to create a different kind of friction. The shop was a hit locally, but the reality of being a small business owner while trying to raise a growing family started to pull Joanna in two different directions. She felt torn every single day. She loved the creative outlet and the community she was building at the store, but her heart was being pulled toward the quiet moments at home with her kids. The hustle was starting to feel less like a dream and more like a heavy weight. After only a few years, she and Chip sat down and made the agonizing decision to close the shop. For Joanna, it felt like a massive failure. She didn't see it as a strategic pause. She saw it as burying a dream before it had a chance to fully grow. She has since talked about how she cried as they locked those doors for what she thought was the final time, wondering if she would ever get that creative spark back, or if she was destined to always be just behind the scenes. During those off years, however, the Magnolia Seed wasn't dead. It was just dormant, gathering strength in the soil. They pivoted back to focusing solely on their construction business, but this time, they were sharper. Chip was getting faster at the demolition, learning the bones of Waco's historic homes, and Joanna was getting much more intentional about her design language. They were perfecting the Waco look without even realizing they were creating a brand. They became the local secret, the couple you called if you wanted a house that looked like a piece of art but functioned like a real home for a real family. It was during this period that they learned the most important lesson of their lives: the value of the pivot. When the 2008 housing market crashed and the world seemed to be falling apart, they didn't fold. They tightened their belts, took on smaller jobs, and figured out how to make beauty out of even tighter budgets. They were becoming resilient in a way that only comes from staring down potential bankruptcy and deciding to keep building anyway. Then came the phone call that changed the trajectory of their lives forever. A production company had seen some photos of their work on a design blog and wanted to talk. Chip, in his typical skeptical fashion, actually thought it was a prank or a scam. He almost didn't call them back, thinking no one would want to watch a couple of kids from Waco flip houses. But Joanna felt a glimmer of something familiar. The same nervous, excited energy she had when she first opened the little shop on Bosque. They agreed to film a pilot, thinking it would be a fun memory to show their grandkids one day, never dreaming it would lead to a global empire. They had no idea that their authentic, messy, banter-filled relationship was exactly what a tired television audience was craving. When Fixer Upper finally aired, it didn't just showcase renovated houses, it showcased a partnership that felt real and deeply rooted. The dormant seed had finally found the right soil, and it was about to explode into a cultural phenomenon that would put Waco on the map and turn their little family business into a household name across the entire world. The transition from local house flippers to global icons didn't happen in a vacuum. It was a whirlwind that picked them up and dropped them into a reality neither of them could have ever mapped out. The Fixer Upper era. When the pilot of Fixer Upper first hit the airwaves, Nobody, not even the executives at HGTV, could have predicted the cultural earthquake it was about to trigger. For Chip and Joanna, the sudden spotlight felt less like a warm glow and more like a high-speed chase. One day, they were just a couple of parents in Waco trying to make payroll, and the next, they were the faces of a movement. People weren't just tuning in to see the houses, they were tuning in to see the chemistry. The show worked because it wasn't a scripted, polished performance. It was Chip being a total goofball, jumping through drywall and eating cockroaches for a laugh, while Joanna rolled her eyes with an affectionate, "Here we go again" look that every person in a long-term relationship recognized instantly. They were the most relatable superstars on the planet. But behind the scenes, the logistics of that fame were becoming a logistical nightmare. Filming a television show of that scale is a grueling 12-hour-a-day commitment. And they weren't just doing it once a week. They were doing it for months on end, while simultaneously running their actual construction business and raising 5 kids in an unfinished farmhouse. The pace was breathtaking. Joanna has often spoken about the blur of those middle seasons, where the line between their private life and their public brand started to disappear entirely. Every time they stepped out for groceries or took the kids to a local park, they were met with cameras or fans seeking a piece of the Magnolia magic. The farmhouse, which was supposed to be their sanctuary, was now a recognizable landmark. They had to learn how to navigate the reality that their simple life had become the most watched commodity in home renovation history. It was a period of massive financial growth, but also of massive personal sacrifice. The shiplap revolution wasn't just a design trend, it was a full-scale economic boom for the city of Waco. Suddenly, people were flying in from all over the world just to see the silos or catch a glimpse of the couple at work. But as the empire expanded to include books, furniture lines, a magazine, and eventually their own network, the fixer-upper wasn't just the house on the screen, it was their schedule. They were living in a constant state of hyper-speed. Chip was still the guy who wanted to say yes to every adventure, but even he started to feel the weight of the expectations. They were no longer just flipping houses. They were responsible for the livelihoods of hundreds of employees. Every decision carried the weight of a multi-million-dollar brand. The pressure to keep the momentum going was immense. And for a couple that valued authenticity above all else, the artifice of the TV world began to rub them the wrong way. By the time they reached the 5th season, they were at the absolute peak of their power, which is exactly when they did the unthinkable. They announced they were walking away.
We are making an announcement today that the 5th season, which will begin in November and take us all the way into second quarter 2018, will be our last.
To the industry, it looked like career-ending move. Why would you quit the most popular show on cable when you're at the top? But for Chip and Joe, it was a desperate act of self-preservation. They could feel the Magnolia dream starting to drift away from the core values of family and groundedness that started it all. They needed to stop the cameras so they could focus on being a family again. They needed to go back to the dirt and the dust, without a production crew hovering over their shoulders. This era proved that while they were good at television, they were even better at knowing when to protect what mattered most. It was the ultimate demo day for their own lives, tearing down the structure of fame to see if the foundation of their marriage was still strong enough to hold the weight of everything they had built together. Empire established. When Chip and Joanna walked away from their hit show, the world thought they were retreating, but in reality, they were just clearing the site for a much sturdier structure. Today, the Magnolia brand isn't just about home decor or television ratings. It has become a living, breathing ecosystem centered in the heart of Waco. The silos, once an abandoned industrial eyesore, have been transformed into a pilgrimage site for people seeking a slice of the intentionality the Gaineses represent. It's a physical manifestation of their belief that anything, no matter how broken or discarded, can be redeemed with enough vision and hard work. But as the footprint of their business grew to include a sprawling lifestyle network and a global retail presence, the way they navigated that power changed. They moved from being the fixers to being the curators of a certain way of life. The legacy they are building isn't just about shiplap or neutral color palettes. It's about the permission to be human in a world that demands perfection. By launching the Magnolia Network, they didn't just want more airtime, they wanted to provide a platform for other creators who shared their values of storytelling, hard work, and family. This era of their lives has been defined by a shift from doing to being. They've become much more protective of their time, often retreating to their farmhouse to focus on the rhythms of the land, tending to the garden, caring for their animals, and simply being present for their 5 children. They realized that the most important project they would ever work on wasn't a house in a historic district, but the culture of their own home. The quiet after the storm of their initial fame has brought a new kind of clarity. There is a sense now that Chip and Joanna are no longer trying to prove anything to the world. They've survived the financial scares of their youth, the physical toll of injury, and the mental exhaustion of the spotlight. What remains is a partnership that feels more weathered, but significantly stronger than the one we first met a decade ago. They speak often about the concept of marriage 2.0, the idea that you have to constantly tear down the old versions of yourselves to make room for who you are becoming. Their legacy is rooted in this resilience. It's the idea that you can be wildly successful and still keep your hands in the dirt, that you can lead a global company and still be the first person to show up when a neighbor is in need. The story of Chip and Joanna Gaines isn't really about real estate. It's a narrative about the courage to pause when the world tells you to go, and the wisdom to prioritize the person standing next to you over the brand you've built together. If this moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another fascinating celebrity story.